Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma for our monthly webinar series. I'm Dedrick Perkins. I am a social work intern, and we are almost finished with the 2019-2020 season. Our hope is that we are continuing the conference's tradition of working to improve racial and ethnic relations on college campuses by providing virtual learning opportunities. NCORE webinars are held twice a month on the first and last Wednesdays. The first Wednesdays are paid webinars. On March 25th, Dr. Julie Enriquez Aldana from Tulane University will present on the experiences of Latina faculty seeking tenure at Research One institutions. The cost is $25 and registration is still open. Our student webinars are held on the first Wednesday of every month and focuses on ideas that speak directly to the experiences of students and is either facilitated or co-facilitated by a student. They are intended to identify emerging scholars and connect students in the NCORE community to each other. Our next student webinar will be in September. Make sure you're live posting. We want to see where you're watching. Tweet, Instagram, and Facebook pictures from your office with the hashtag NCORE and start the conversation online. You may end up in a very special NCORE video, wink, wink. Today, we have Emma Allen and Stephanie Cross of the University of Oklahoma. Together, they will discuss the effects of dehumanization of Indigenous women and their lived experiences both in and outside of the University of Oklahoma. The center is grateful for their expertise.
Hi, I'm Emma Allen, and this is Stephanie Cross. Thank you for joining our webinar.
So first, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Sorry about that. We gather to learn on the land placed by its creator in the care and protection of the Hasinai, Caddo, and Kitikiti-Ish Wichita peoples, and originally shared by many Indigenous nations, including the Kaigu, Kiowa, Numina, Comanche, the Naisha, and Nade Apache, as a place of gathering, healing, and exchange. We would also like to acknowledge that the city of Norman was once known as a sundown town, where primarily Black people faced discrimination and violence if they were within the city limits past sunset. And we're doing this because it's important to acknowledge this specific history because the University of Oklahoma, in what is currently known as Oklahoma, cannot escape this legacy, especially as an institution of learning, and that this place was and continues to be a site of perpetual violence, primarily aimed at brown and Black bodies.
It is the expectation of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies that all participants at NCORE enjoy a welcoming and inclusive environment free from all forms of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. NCORE is committed to fostering an atmosphere that encourages the free expression and exchange of ideas. In pursuit of that ideal, NCORE is committed to the promotion of equality of opportunity and treatment for all NCORE participants in NCORE-sponsored events, regardless of gender identity or expression, race, color, national or ethnic origin, religion or religious beliefs, age, marital status, sexual orientation, immigration status, disabilities, veteran status, or body size. So hi, like I said, my name is Emma Allen. I am a third-year doctoral student at OU in adult and higher education. I am a proud citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I also have Kiowa and Caddo descendancy.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Cross. I am an enrolled citizen of the Comanche Nation. I identify as a queer Indigenous woman. I am currently a PhD candidate in psychology, psychology department here at OU.
So in this webinar, we will provide some clarification on terminology that we will use. We will then provide some background, brief statistics on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I will then provide some clarification on what settler colonialism is, and then Stephanie will give some background information on the ways in which settler colonialism perpetuates violence against Indigenous women. We will then move on to talking about our own research. So I will be starting talking about my research on Native American doctoral student experiences. And then Stephanie will then talk about her dissertation research on the objectification and dehumanization of Native American women. We will then end the presentation with some practical implications.
Okay, so in this webinar, we will be using Indigenous, Native, Native American, Indian, American Indian interchangeably. And this is because under the umbrella of indigeneity, those of us who are enrolled citizens of federally recognized tribes are conferred a unique status relative to non-enrolled Indigenous peoples in what is currently known as the United States. And we will be speaking more in our webinar and our research to the experiences of Indigenous peoples that are placed on this land. So typically when we as Native people refer to ourselves and each other, we use a combination of these terms, but we mostly use the names that are from our tribal nations. However, we would like to acknowledge that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls affect all Indigenous peoples, especially those situated along borders, whether those are imposed national borders or reservation borders. Additionally, the term Indian is a legal term used in American federal law and policy and other important documents, such as the Declaration of Independence. Now, I also want to take this opportunity to point out how inappropriate the S word is when referring to Native American women. If you're not familiar, it is a word that rhymes with straw. And again, I will not be saying this word. However, it will come up again because unfortunately, this is not a word that can be disconnected from the violence towards Indigenous women in North America. So here are a few statistics from data collected about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which is known by the acronym of MMIWG. So unfortunately, for those of us who are Native and who are Native and Indigenous women, these statistics are not new to us. So according to the FBI, Native American women are 3 times as more likely to experience rape or sexual assault than Black or Latina women. Native American women also face murder rates that are more than 10 times the national average. Now, as you see on the right, there is an infographic from the Urban Indian Health Institute from a report that they conducted in 2018, looking at different urban cities across the United States. So here they identified 506 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases across 71 selected urban cities. 128 of those were cases of missing Indigenous women. 280 of the 506 were cases of murdered Indigenous women. 98 were cases with an unknown status. And it's important to note that the median age of these victims was 29. And so why has this been allowed to happen? Our Indigenous women and girls are being taken from us at an alarming rate. And while awareness of this issue is increasing, like I've said before, this is not new to us as Native and Indigenous people. And so we will be providing some background information on how violence against Indigenous women has not only been historically perpetuated, but how this violence is necessary for the endgame of settler colonialism. So now I'll turn it over to Emma, who will provide a brief overview of what settler colonialism is.
Okay, so what is settler colonialism? Settler colonialism is a structure and not an event. It cannot be condensed into one single occurrence, but it's rather a continuous process. Since the settlers come to make a new home on the land, they stay, and then they repeat colonizing practices. It is imperative that the Indigenous people of the land disappear by either genocide, assimilation, or removal so that the settlers can become the sovereign owners of the territory and their resources. Within the settler colonial structure, people, land, and knowledge are property of the settler. It is the settler's goal to gather more land and resources and then to protect what they already have. Further, settler colonialism is ensured by institutions of higher education, from the Indigenous land that is built upon to the Western curricula that is taught in the classrooms to the research that is conducted inside and outside of the institution. The university follows the settler colonial aim.
So with this understanding that settler colonialism is an ongoing structure and that it works to eradicate and replace Native Indigenous peoples, it should be no surprise that upon contact, violence against Indigenous women is and was and is necessary for settler colonialism to thrive, okay? So upon contact, European settlers paved the way for this to happen through the deliberate depreciation of Native American women. This included diminishing their traditional and influential roles and leadership positions within their tribal nations, and through physical assault, sexual violence, and murder. To accomplish this, Indigenous men were encouraged to treat Indigenous women as subordinates, which was counter to their traditional values. So Indigenous men who were in power and refused to treat women in this manner were quickly replaced and replaced by others who would uphold those Eurocentric patriarchal views. Now, this is not to say that there were Indigenous men that were totally eager in taking these roles, but it was quickly understood by tribal leaders that for their tribal nation to survive, they had to adapt to this imposed worldview. Additionally, Native children were forcibly removed and educated in boarding schools, indoctrinating them through Christianity, European education, and the ideology that Native and Indigenous peoples were primitive and uncivilized. And this served many purposes, but mainly it made sure that traditional knowledges and ways of knowing and understanding were not passed down between generations. This means from grandparents to children, to grandchildren, from parents to children, et cetera, right? And that this assimilationist policies would actually assimilate Indigenous children into the larger majority culture. Thereby, they would forget, their own heritage and where they come from. Sorry about that. Now, because Indigenous people were infantilized and viewed as uncivilized, the federal government, the American federal government, initiated many policies that were supposedly to the benefit of Native peoples, but were mostly used to deal with the Indian problem. So, for example, the Supreme Court determined that tribal nations were not fully developed and viewed them as being wards or domestic dependent nations that needed the federal government to basically take care of it. Now, because of this ruling, several periods of law and policy, including removal, allotment, relocation and termination, even the Indian reorganization, eroded tribal sovereignty and the ability for tribal nations to govern and care for its citizens. This also extended to crimes committed on Native lands, with the Major Crimes Act and Public Law 280 having some of the most detrimental effects on tribal citizens, hindering tribal nations' rights to prosecute certain crimes on their lands when they were committed on their lands. And so violence against Native women is also perpetuated both historically and presently through representations and also lack of representations when we think about it in a contemporary sense. For example, when Europeans first began depicting the New World, images of a strong, wild, barbaric Indigenous queen were used to signal the dangers and perils of not only the New World, but also the allure of Indigenous women and Indigenous people. And so we see an era of this, of Indigenous women being used to personify the New World and by extension, land and resources. And so after European settlers recognized this New World as having an abundance of resources, the representations of the New World and the Americas, right, changed, okay? And so instead of a dangerous Amazonian-like queen, America was visualized as a young, naked Indigenous woman. And here, this is a depiction called Discovery of America, Vespucci landing in America. The first contact of European civilization with Native Americans is visualized here as an erotic image of a passive, vulnerable female waiting for her lover / conqueror. And there's notes about what's going on in the background that are shown here as emphasizing the complete ignorance of Native Americans. That's what it's described as. So, for example, cannibals roasting human flesh, having no dwellings, very little clothing, and no dwellings to sleep in, and basically running around with other exotic, untamed animals that are roaming the landscape. Okay. So from this depiction, it's clear the connection being made between, like I said before, the New World and the land resources as a consumable resource, much like Indigenous women, and both were being characterized as willing and open to settler exploitation. And it's also known that Indigenous women were used and exploited by European men to gain access to hunting lands, territories, territories and status within tribal nations. And today, this consumption of Indigenous lands, resources, and Indigenous women can be seen in the connection with fracking, okay? Extracting oil from the land, right? With the rise of men's camps connected to the increase of sexual violence against women, and especially Indigenous women. Now, the representations of Indigenous women are still largely problematic today. So, first of all, in general, images of contemporary Native people are far outnumbered by Black and white images of our ancestors, okay? And when it comes to gender differences, Native and Indigenous men are far more represented in history and popular culture in both face and name than women are. So some of the more iconic representations of Native and Indigenous women come from the Western film genre, and also like literature and other mediums like that. But Westerns really have a place in the American mythos. And so in these films, Native women were depicted as like sacrificial lovers to the white male lead, where they could not, they did not live to see the end of the story, basically. There are other images like being an Indian princess, which one of the more well-known Indian princesses that we know of course, is like Pocahontas, especially Disney's Pocahontas. And of course, women that were regarded as the S word, which again, I will not be repeating. So going back to the Indian princess image, one might think that this being a positive image would be very great and beneficial for us as Native women. However, there are several reasons why that's just not true. And this is because it ignores the harm that can occur when using this stereotype, because it's still a stereotype, right? It's a limited way of representing a vast majority of different types of people. It's also dismissive, and as we know from the last few, maybe even decades, and in our current political climate, words like Pocahontas have and can be used as slurs against Native women, which incite aggressive behaviors and violence towards them. Not to mention that, like I said earlier, Indigenous women of higher status and power were not necessarily saved from sexual violence. Similarly, when we think about the S word, women who were called that and referred to as such were portrayed as women that were degenerates who could be used and abused by not only white settlers, but also even their own Native people for many unseemly purposes. Now, finally, it's useful to understand how cultural appropriation can lead to harmful consequences for Native women. On Halloween of last year, 2019, Pamela Anderson, who's on your screen now, posted this picture of herself. And in response, many Natives and allies criticized her decision by tweeting back. Okay, so here you can see one person stated that our culture is not a costume. We face deadly hardships as a natural part of our life because Native women are objectified, stolen, and murdered at a genocidal rate, and that these types of images only help to objectify Native sisters everywhere, and to please educate yourself on MMIW. Additionally, we see that another person pointed out that Indigenous women are targeted for sexual violence at more than 3 times the national average. And this type of hypersexualization, when connected to this type of imagery, doesn't help. And it's also that even if some people don't think it's an issue, like cultural appropriation, right? A lot of people don't think it's a big deal. It still doesn't mean it's not a big issue for others, like for us, okay? And one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that there's this response, which is coming on your screen now, So this particular response highlights a key issue that the previous tweets I read about are stating, right? That when a non-Native woman decides to wear Indian costumes, specifically sexualized costumes like Pocahontas or reservation princesses, that it can lead to increased prejudice and sexually aggressive behaviors towards women in general, but especially towards Native American women, okay? And so, having gone through this background, which is it's a very brief overview, right? Because pretty much each of these topics can be a class, a semester-long class of its own, right? But having gone through this, I want you to stop and think about how this type of violence affects Native American women. How does it affect the way Native women view themselves? And how do you think it affects how you or others, primarily non-Native people, think and act, think what they think about and how they act towards Native and Indigenous peoples, okay? Because these are questions that not only drive mine and Emma's scholarship, but they affect our daily lives, okay? And so now I'm gonna turn it over to Emma so that she can discuss her research.
Hello again. Before I go into my research, I want to share briefly why I chose to focus on my issue. So for the majority of my adult life, I've been in college, give or take a year. During my undergrad and graduate journey, there have been many times where I felt uncomfortable, mad, sad, or frustrated when particular incidents happened to me. They felt off to me, but I couldn't tell if what I was experiencing was racism or not. I often wondered if I was just making it up or exaggerating or, being ridiculous. Back then, I really didn't have the language or the knowledge to fully express or understand what these experiences were. As I got into my doctoral program, I started to delve more into the experiences that racial minority groups have with racism at institutions of higher education. I began looking at what racial microaggressions were and how they manifested. So this eventually led me to my research question, which is, how do Native American doctoral students experience microaggressions at a non-Native college or university? And further, how does settler colonialism help clarify these microaggressions, which are typically thought of as racial, experienced by Native American doctoral students? The slights that I experienced, and frankly still continue to experience to this day, are known as racial microaggressions. Native Americans occupy a unique space of not only being a racial minority group, but a political group as well, since they are citizens of their sovereign tribal nations. Labeling these experiences as purely only racially microaggressive would be false because their citizenship has to be taken into account. So considerations towards the settler colonial structure, which aims to disappear the native from the land through genocide, assimilation, or removal, should be allowed to fully understand these microaggressive experiences. So in my preliminary study, I did semi-structured interviews to investigate how Native American doctoral students experience microaggressions at a non-Native college or university. So what are microaggressions? Microaggressions are, quote, brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults to a target person or group, end quote. So there are three types of microaggressions. The first one is microassaults. These are violent, verbal, or nonverbal attacks. The intent is to harm the individual. The second one is microinsults. So these are disrespectful interactions that belittle an individual's racial identity or ancestry. So it could be something like for example, when a Black university student is constantly asked if they're an athlete, this leaves an underlying message that they wouldn't be at this school if they weren't. So the third one is microinvalidation. So these exchanges that ignore or avoid feelings, thoughts, and experiences of people of color. So it would be like a Latinx or an Asian student being told, wow, you speak English so well. This negates their heritage as Americans and automatically casts them as foreigners. So research on racial microaggressions in higher education has largely focused on American Black, Latinx, and Asian students. Further, no studies have considered how settler colonialism influences these microaggressions towards Native American students. I think it's also important to note that Native Americans are often left out of conversations of racism in academia due to our limited presence in higher education. So in my preliminary study, I interviewed 4 students. 3 of them were women, and they all came from different programs across campus. While none of the women experienced microassaults, they did experience micro insults and micro validations while in class, in professional settings, in non-professional settings, by students, faculty, staff, and others. This is consistent with the research on racism experienced by Native university students, as well as Native student experiences with racial microaggressions. I wanted to share specific stories of microaggressive events that happened to Nikki, Michelle, and Jade in their own words. I believe it is important to raise their voices up because they were often dismissed or denied the right to speak their own truths when these incidents happened. So when these doctoral students encountered microaggressions, they usually felt like they had to address them, but the aggressors tended to be unreceptive or invalidating. All participants spoke about how they approached these microaggressions and how the aggressor received this intervention. Nikki, when discussing how she addressed an aggressor, stressed how she communicated these issues in a polite way. Michelle said, quote, "If I do address it, I'll sit there and I'll wonder if I addressed it in a way that is meaningful and tactful," end quote. So the first story I'm going to talk about happened to Nikki while attending a cultural event on campus with some peers in her cohort. Nikki was telling a person in her program to not call traditional attire costumes while they were attending a Diwali night, and she was met with hostility even though she tried to combat the issue in a nice way. She said, "When I tell her I wasn't being mean, I didn't yell at her. I was just like, hey, you probably didn't know this, but I'm telling you about it." Completely ignoring that, she did not want to hear that. She actually came at me with the dictionary definition of a costume, which I didn't think happened. So Nikki's knowledge was denied as a Native person and scholar, and she even pathologized the way that she spoke to not come off rude or aggressive. Michelle spoke about one encounter with a professor that eventually was the catalyst towards her switching her degree programs. She had always thought about switching, but was scared to. Then she wrote a historical paper in one of her classes, and it did talk about race from a Native perspective, but she used archival research and was stating that this was governmental policy at the time. My professor in that class was a white male. He told me to revise my paper. He took the part I made a claim, which I feel like it's a well-researched, well-supported claim, that the policy of the US government was to indoctrinate Native children into a form of US nationalism. He took that out, and one of the comments that he made to me was that I was leaning towards preaching or sermonizing, and that really doesn't do anything, and there's no one truth. This disregard and removal of Michelle's knowledge as a Native person and scholar conveyed that her contributions were unimportant and demeaned her racial heritage and identity. Jade had an experience like Michelle's with another professor where her Indigenous knowledge was ignored. She said, "The professor told me that my work was inadequate. I think her exact words on my feedback on my paper were, 'I would bet money this study has been done before. You need to do better on your lit review.' After she told me that, I then contacted my mentor and was talking to her about it. She put me in contact with the one person who had done research on that issue at that point, and it was a dissertation. I cited an email where the scholar told me there's no research on that subject for her, the professor, to kind of back off. These micro insults came in the form of professors disregarding the expertise and historical reality that Native people know to be true, indicating that they, the non-Native professors, were more knowledgeable about Native issues and people than the Native students. I also want to address the frequency that participants experience microaggressions. Although they discussed specific incidents to me, this didn't capture all of their microaggressive experiences. These microaggressions were experienced daily and left the participants feeling emotionally drained. Jade spoke about how her classes are weekly reminders how the dominant culture is valued over her culture. She said, literally every single week we talk about, be careful of your bias, don't insert your bias in there. And so like every single time we talk about that, I'm just like, blah. And every time we talk about those aspects of research that don't just mesh well with Indigenous approaches to research, it's kind of always a reminder. Okay, just take it, do what you need to do, get out of here. So it's weekly, every time I'm in class, basically. For many Native researchers, being able to remove ourselves from our work is impossible since we tend to work with our communities with the objective of giving back. Minthorn and Shotton stated this production of scholarship through a Native lens is, quote, guided by our lived experiences, cultural values, and the embedded responsibility to address the needs of Indigenous people within research and higher education. And so for Jade, this push towards being unbiased was a constant reminder that her Indigenous approach to research was not valued within her university. So whereas Jade spoke about encountering microaggressions every time she was in the class, Michelle and Nikki spoke how at times these incidents were often thought about as being isolated, when in reality, they are in fact part of a larger systemic issue. When asked about the frequency of microaggressions experienced, Michelle indicated that within her doctoral program, she has probably had 3 to 4 incidents per semester that she can recall. And it's by different students. It's not just one individual, it's faculty too. Nikki acknowledged that within her interview that she had even separated microaggressions instead of looking at them all together. I think it's actually sitting and talking about it when it's the subject, microaggressions, not just racial microaggressions, but others. I don't think I've actually talked about them all before. I just talked about them as isolated incidents. So this finding was particularly captivating to me because it illustrates not only how commonplace that they are, but how we as Native students may cope with these microaggressions by internalizing them and then dismissing them. So I'm just at the beginning of my research, so bear with me because I'm trying to interpret and investigate what these experiences mean and how to discuss them in the context of settler colonialism. And while these stories that I've shared and other stories that have been told to me can fall under the micro-invalidations and micro-insults categories of racial microaggressions, this also fails to consider the unique relationship that these individuals have as citizens of tribal nations. So I thus assert that these are actually settler aggressions because settler colonialism exerts that knowledge is property of the settlers, and settlers use strategies to position themselves as innocent in the colonization process. So in Nikki and Jade's experience, settlers who were not always of European descent laid claim to be the holders of knowledge, thus denying and erasing what these Native people know to be true. In Michelle's story, her professor not only erased this knowledge, but also moved towards innocence to remove feelings of guilt or responsibility without having to give up land or power or privilege, without having to change much at all. So what I would like for my future research to do is to further investigate what settler aggressions are, how they manifest, how to categorize them, and how settler colonialism is perpetuated through these aggressions within higher education.
Okay, hello again. So as I said earlier, I identify as a queer Indigenous woman, okay? And so I want to talk a little bit about why I'm interested in this research and why it's important to me. So although I am enrolled Comanche, I'm also descended from Mexican Indigenous tribal nations for which I have no name for. And so representations, for the most part, have always just been interesting to me, but especially representations of Native Americans. I grew up in a mixed family, and whereas my mom and sisters are Mexican American, I had no contact with my Comanche relatives. And because of that, I felt like I was always trying to figure out what it meant to be Native. What did it mean to be a Native American? What did it mean to be Comanche? And so, like pretty much every other kid out there, right, I was always trying to find myself in the world around me. Or, you know, find something that I could look to as a model of, you know, what I'm supposed to be like, or, you know, someone that I could look up to, besides my family, who I love, of course. And so growing up, there's very limited representations, of course, for people of color. And so for me, some of my biggest idols were Selena, or rather Jennifer Lopez as Selena, and Disney's Pocahontas, okay? And that's obviously a problem, right? And so when I was starting to learn more about what psychology was, and I was trying to make the decision of what I wanted to do, I realized that I wanted to learn more about how these representations affect not only the self, but how we communicate and make impressions of other people, okay? Our attitudes about them. And so it's always been very clear to me that any research that I do, it must benefit more people outside of myself, right? And hopefully, to me, it's always been important to me that my research benefits Native American peoples, okay? And not just, you know, my tribe, and not just me, but all Indigenous peoples, right? As much as that is possible. And because of that, I started to research the effects of Native representations on attitudes towards Native American people. I was able to do my thesis, and I was actually able to take that work to NCORE, if not last year, a couple of years ago, about the consequences of Native American mascots on attitudes towards Native peoples. And so for me, this is not just some niche topic or something cool that I picked up on and thought, oh, hey, this would be really cool to make a career out of, right? It's actually something that's near and dear to me because it affects not only me, but the people that I love and care about, okay? And so throughout my kind of coming to this knowledge of what objectification and dehumanization is, especially what it looks like in psychology, it became clear to me that there is very little understanding of how this type of objectification and dehumanization affects Native American and Indigenous peoples. So first, I want to begin about talking about how psychologists conceptualize objectification and dehumanization, because I'm pretty sure that everyone out there, especially those of you who are watching, already have an idea of what this means, right? But one of the things that I've learned being a psychologist is that there are words that are used, that are psychology words that are used in like popular culture and outside of academia that don't necessarily have the same definition, the way that we use them in the psychology field. And so I will begin by discussing how objectification and dehumanization are conceptualized by and discussed by psychologists. And also, this is the psychological framework that I will be using in my dissertation research. So in 1997, Fredrickson and Roberts proposed objectification theory. And this theory states that women are sexually objectified, that women are treated as objects for the use of others, mostly male pleasure, and that this objectification leads to mental health issues. And through this research, understanding this, using this theory, there's been a lot of research on objectification leading to a number of psychological consequences, such as the increase of appearance anxiety and anxiety about physical safety, which then can lead to mental health issues such as disordered eating, depression, and sexual dysfunction, okay? Now, sexual objectification can be experienced either through a direct or indirect way. And so, for example, a person can experience being sexually objectified and how that affects their self and how they think about it, how they internalize it, and how it affects those types of mental health consequences that I mentioned. However, indirectly, we know that women especially can internalize the sexual objectification of others, okay? And by that, I mean, how women are typically represented can affect how women think of themselves, okay? So for example, content media analyses have shown that when looking at magazines, commercials, print ads, and other media, like television and stuff like that, that women tend to be portrayed with less face and more body, especially that body having more revealed skin, less clothing. And also they tend to be photographed or represented in more sexually provocative poses. And the opposite is true for men. So in this analysis, researchers found that men tend to be represented more in terms of their face, less full body, and when they do have their body being represented, they tend to be fully clothed and also in placed in positions of power. And so, moving away from the self, researchers became interested in understanding the process of itself, of objectification itself, and how we engage in that from person to person, okay? That is, how and why do we objectify others? And how do we measure this objectification? Well, from social perception theory, we know that a large part of how we make evaluations of others is going to be based on 3 dimensions. That is competence, morality, and warmth. And it's these 3 dimensions that actually make up 95% of people's overall evaluations of others. Thus, in order to understand how we objectify others and to be able to measure it, researchers started to focus on outcomes in which certain traits were de-emphasized or denied to others, okay? And so now I will go over 3 specific models that I will be looking at in my research. So the first is the stereotype content model. And the stereotype content model assesses people's behavioral and emotional reactions to others based on perceptions of two dimensions, okay? Warmth, which signals a person's intentions, and competence, which signals their ability to carry out those intentions. And so what they are saying is that when we see another person, we kind of look to these two things to determine how we are going to react to them. All right, so for example, people who belong to, everybody belongs to a certain type of group, okay? And so if I were to say that right now I belong to a group of, I'm one part of a larger group of Indigenous women, right? Well, because that is considered my in group, I would attribute higher warmth and higher competence to them because I admire them, I'm a part of that group, and that makes me feel good as well. Now, this is in contrast to groups that maybe are viewed as being pitied, like the elderly. So the elderly the elderly would have been rated high in warmth, for example, but low in competence. Okay. Now, this is in contrast to groups that tend to be more envied, like the rich. So people who are rich are not viewed as being very warm. In fact, we think of them as being more cold, but they are seen as being very competent because for the most part, they had to do something to get that money. And I know there's a lot of things to say about that, but we view them as being more competent and less warm in general. Okay. Now contrast this to groups that evoke disgust and even like stigmatized groups such as the homeless, where people have unambivalently seen or rated the homeless as being both low in warmth and competence. Okay. Now, the next model that I'm going to go over is human nature. Okay. So Lonen and Haslam identified human nature traits, or that which people perceive as separating humans from animals and objects or automata. And here we can see a subset of traits that speak to human uniqueness. That is what separates humans from animals. Now, as you can see here, humans are distinguished from animals on attributes including cognitive capacity, civility, and refinement. And these are traits that have been researched as embodying human uniqueness, for one, but also these are traits that people tend to view as being developed later on in life. Okay, so one example of this, when we think about cultural stereotypes and like cultural knowledge, is the ways in which we view children for the most part. So for example, culturally as Americans, I would say, and I'm sure it happens elsewhere, but we tend to dehumanize children because we view them as not necessarily, well, first of all, they're childlike, they're a little irrational, right? They kind of move on instinct as much as you try to rein them in and handle them. They're a little bit coarse, and you kind of think of them as lacking culture, right? Because you have to start to teach them like, oh, well, you know, when you're in public, maybe don't pick your nose. And well, maybe if you are going to talk to this adult, you should be a little bit more polite. And so we kind of see this dehumanization play out in the ways in which we talk and view children. All right, so that's just an example. Now, similarly, we have this picture is a subset of traits that refers to human nature. That is what separates humans from machines. Now, as you can see here, these traits are more essence-like, and they are more universal, and as you can tell, more emotion-related. And so when I think of an example of how culturally we tend to stereotype other cultures as Americans, right? One of the ways in which we kind of deny these human nature traits to other cultures is specifically with Germans or even Russians. So we have this stereotype that German and Russian people are very cold and rigid, and they can't take a joke, and they just, you know, there's something a little weird about them, right? So in that way, we can see how we deny those human nature traits and deny that warmth to other people, okay? And that's just an example. So the last model that I'm going to talk about is mind perception, okay? So Gray and Wegner suggests that people assign two primary characteristics to the human mind, that is experience and agency. Now, experience is the capacity for sensations and feelings, someone to feel these things, so like joy and pleasure, and agency is the ability to do things such as planning and self-control. Now, entities and people who are viewed as being high in experience are viewed as possessing high moral patiency, which means that they deserve moral consideration. And the opposite is true for those who are seen as being low in experience. Now, agency is perceived, when people who are perceived as being high in agency, they are perceived as having more mind. So as you can see with planning and self-control, it's also the ability to make, deliberate decisions and those kinds of things. And so all of this to say that denial of these capacities is dehumanizing. And so with mind perception specifically, research has shown that adult men and women are rated very high on both in general, and they are much higher than, for instance, robots and dead people. So what are some of the ways in which these models have been used to understand how people are objectified and what that process is actually like, okay? Well, Lonan and colleagues reported that when women's bodies were emphasized more than their faces, which again is a pattern that we see in the world around us, right? These women were viewed as being lower in experience, meaning they had a less capacity to feel pleasure, pain, and hunger, which again means that they were less deserving of moral consideration, and were viewed as having less agency, that is less capable of planning, acting morally, and possessing self-control, which is obviously a problem, right? And furthermore, we know that when women are objectified, they are viewed as less competent, okay? In addition to being viewed as less competent, sexually objectified women are viewed as having less mind and being less worthy of moral concern, which is I've stated previously. Now, sexualized women, so when women are viewed in more sexualized manner, were viewed as possessing significantly lower IQs than non-sexualized women. And as I said before, they were judged as being less capable or even less suited to performing a range of everyday jobs like lawyer, stockbroker, scientist, and those kinds of jobs, all right? Furthermore, Holland and Haslam demonstrated that sexualized girls were viewed as lacking in mind relative to non-sexualized girls, meaning that this is a process that affects not only adult women, but younger girls as well. What's more, sexualized depictions of women who were rape victims and victims of domestic violence evoked lower attributions of mind and morality and were attributed less moral standing. And this is especially important when considering that when these women who were victims of rape and sexual assault were depicted in sexualized manners, participants viewed them as being more worthy of victim blaming them. So there's victim blaming that was happening, but also participants were less likely to feel empathy for these women. And again, that's obviously a problem. So while the research on objectification and dehumanization has grown considerably within the past decade, there have been very few studies that have investigated the role of racism in objectification and have looked at the effects of objectification on women of color. So, and this of course is not taken into account the historical, political, and sociocultural factors that affect non-white women. So it's important to be able to have more of this type of research going on. So one of the few studies is actually from Anderson and colleagues, which demonstrated that Black women were implicitly associated with both animals and objects to a greater degree than white women, which correlates to the ways in which Black women are stereotyped and sexualized differently than white women are, okay? Meaning that there that further exploration is needed to understand the unique ways that all women, especially women of color, experience objectification and dehumanization. And so because of this, I think it's important to consider the role of prejudice in this research, specifically racial prejudice and anti-Native prejudice. So in this line of research, we know that outcomes will vary depending on whether someone is high or low in a variable. So here, depending on how high someone is in prejudice, may lead to a different outcome than someone who is low in prejudice, right? And so for my research, I will be looking at two individual differences underlying prejudice towards social groups, albeit with different motivations. So the first is right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA. Okay, and this is characterized by a deference to authority and self-righteousness. So people who are high in RWA value obedience to authority. They are very comfortable with higher degrees of social control, and they will conform more readily to social norms. But not only that, they expect others to also fall in line, basically, okay? And previous research has actually shown that people who are high in RWA have more negative attitudes towards Native Americans. And one of the reasons this was theorized to be is that because Native and Indigenous people, they may view them as being too pushy in their demand for rights, and especially like rights like treaty rights, okay? Now, social dominance, in contrast, is characterized by the desire for group-based dominance over subordinate groups, okay? So individuals who are high in social dominance will show hostility to outgroups that they perceive as breaching the status power boundary between subordinate and dominant groups. And people who are high in social dominance value group power, dominance, and superiority. So they tend to believe that there is a hierarchy of groups, that's just how it's going to be, and that's how it always is, and that some groups are just simply inferior to other groups. It's also important to consider sexism, which has been shown already to play a role in the objectification of women. So for example, men who endorse sexist beliefs are going to be more likely to objectify women in general, okay, regardless of whether she is in revealing clothing or not. Now, the ambivalent sexism inventory, or the ASI, encompasses both hostile and benevolent attitudes, okay? And it's been shown that a belief in one part of sexism is actually going to be positively correlated with the belief in the other part. So, for example, people who are high in ambivalent sexism are going to believe equally that first, women are nurturing and caring, which would be a benevolent sexist attitude, and also that women don't necessarily belong in the workplace, which would be a hostile sexist attitude. And so, while the understanding that women are going to be the ones who experience the harmful consequences of objectification, no research has investigated how Native American women are dehumanized by non-natives and under what circumstances. And so considering all the ways in which violence towards Native American women has been historically perpetuated, resulting in high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, it's important to consider how objectification and dehumanization looks different for Indigenous women. So some of my research questions very broadly, right, going into my pilot study and helping me kind of determine where I'm going to go with that are Native American women objectified differently than European American women? Are Native American women described less human nature and uniquely human traits specifically? And then, of course, considering all the other models that I talked about and other outcomes, do non-Native men and women objectify Native American women differently? And so now I will discuss some of my data that I have gathered in my study. But first, I'm going to walk you through the design. So for my pilot study, I conducted a simple between subjects experiment with two conditions. So the first, participants answered different measures, which included the prejudice measures of RWA, social dominance, and before they saw pictures. So they saw the measures, they went through those measures, and then they were randomly assigned to either view the Native American woman on your left or the white woman on your right. And so it's important to note that they were randomly assigned to view either condition, but if you saw one, you did not see the other, okay? So after seeing the picture, viewing the picture, there were measures that participants had to answer, which included the objectification and dehumanization outcomes. Okay. So I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, but bear with me. I promise that we'll get through this together. So on the left, you'll see correlations for the variables in the Native American condition. That is participants who viewed a Native American woman and not the white woman. All right. Now on the right, you will see the correlations for the variables in where participants saw the white woman, but not the Native American. First thing to note is that there are no significant correlations between prejudice and even sexism with these dehumanization and objectification outcomes. So it's clear that the prejudice measures that I was talking about and these outcomes are significant in the Native American condition. All right, so that means that prejudice has a lot more to do with how people attribute or deny these human traits and objectification outcomes, okay? So as you can see here, for those people who were high in right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance, they viewed the Native woman as being easier to take advantage of. They viewed her as feeling more pain. People who are high in social dominance attributed less mind to the Native American woman, and they attributed her less moral standing, okay? Now with RWA, we see that similar patterns, right? So we see that people who were high in right-wing authoritarianism somehow believe that the Native woman could experience more pain. And also we see that for some reason, and I'm not entirely sure why, this has struck me as odd, but attraction seems to play a role in these relationships as well, whereas it does not for the people who view the white woman. So attraction, when considering how attractive the participants found the Native woman, it also influenced the degree to which these relationships were significant or not. So the next slide, again, not as many numbers, but still pretty similar, right? We see that, again, the pattern for non-significant relationships for viewing the white woman is still there. And we see that there are some significant relationships for when participants view the Native woman. So it looks like people who have positive attitudes towards Native Americans tend to view the Native American woman as having more mind and being more thoughtful and also experiencing more intentions, okay? So the MSA on the left, it refers to the mental states attribute. And this measures perceptions, wishes, thoughts, and intentions. Then the thoughts refer to imagining, knowing, reasoning, and thinking, whereas intentions are choosing, deciding, expecting, and intending, okay? So basically, we could also view this as showing that people who have negative attitudes of Native American people are going to view the Native American woman as having less thoughts, less intentions, and less mental states overall. And at the bottom, you'll see that each of the prejudice measures correlates with competence, such that people who are high in RWA and social dominance and ambivalent sexism view the Native American woman as being less competent. And for attitudes towards Native Americans, people who have positive attitudes are going to view her more competently, but that also means that if you have negative attitudes towards Native Americans, you are going to view her less competently, okay? So, I know that was a lot of data, so I will, which I could talk about for a long time, but I'm going to move on. And so I think that seeing those relationships, those relationships can be explained in terms of settler colonialism, okay, where violence towards Indigenous women is instrumental. And doing this research and talking about it, I hope to bring about more awareness of these differences and more importantly, supplement the data that already exists in the form of qualitative research and Indigenous people's own stories and lived experiences. And so obviously this work is far from over. This is just a pilot study and there were a lot of things that it's good to know the direction I'm heading in is like the right direction, but there are so many more variables to consider and test, and that's something that I am working on doing this semester. And I think it's important, again, to understand how objectification and dehumanization looks different for, especially for Native and Indigenous women, okay? And so with that, Emma and I will talk about some practical implications while I drink some water real quick. So one thing that we wanted to stress that it's very important to create and maintain good relationships, okay? And by this we mean to be more deliberate in how you, as an individual, and even as part of an institution, the institution, right? Be more deliberate in how you communicate with Indigenous peoples, okay? So talking from my own experience, one thing that I've noticed on the individual level is the degree to which I've experienced microaggressions in my department, which Emma has already talked a lot about, right? And it hasn't been easy when I've called out some people, but fortunately in the past few times that I've done this, where I've been in class and someone used a phrase and I've been able to call them out, I've been met with respect. And not only that, but like genuinely good intentions. So for example, there have been several times where people around me use phrases like, let's have a powwow, or, you know, oh, they're the lowest man on the totem pole. And when I've said something about it, there's usually a pause, and there's always that awkward moment where you're just like, I don't know how they're gonna act, and everybody else heard, like, how's this gonna go? But there was a pause, and then there was an acknowledgement, and then it was okay. There was no fight, there was no pushback. Instead, I was acknowledged and apologized to, and then later on, people would tell me like, I'm so glad that you told me about that. I'm, you know, trying to make sure that I don't use that, or even I'm gonna make sure that other people don't use it, right?
So when we also talk about that, it's not only about communication between individuals when you get addressed with these microaggressions, it's also about creating opportunities for good relationship building. So what are you doing for the Native students on campus? More than that, what are you doing to connect with the Native community outside of campus, and how are you bringing those together into your programs, into your classrooms, within your curriculum? Like, what are you doing to include Native people? And what are you doing to establish relationships with Native people on campus and outside of campus? I think that is important to remember, because on this land, it's all Indigenous land. So, Stephanie?
So one thing that we both were kind of talking about before is that there tends to be an imbalance in the ways that the Native student community is spotlighted. So for instance, as Native people, we're very proud of our cultural practices and traditions. They're very important to us. And for the most part, we're pretty comfortable in sharing, you know, that part of ourselves with other people, with other non-Native people even, right? However, it shouldn't be the only thing that Native students are called upon to do, right? And this is something that a lot of, especially the undergraduate Native students on campus, kind of struggle with, because as much as they want to show that they, you know, love their culture and it's part of who they are, there's this tendency to kind of over rely on that rather than, well, you know, we are here as students. I'm also very proud to, you know, be a hard worker and pursuing my degree and those kinds of things, right? And so it's important to consider where your support networks are for Native students in STEM fields and non-STEM fields, right? And if you're lucky enough that your campus has a Native American Studies degree program or department, that's always seen as a really good network and community support network for Native students. But how about students who aren't, Native students who aren't pursuing Native American Studies degrees, right? Where is the concern and support for them? Often they feel like isolated in their own departments because they are surrounded by faculty where there are no Native people, there are no other Native students, and maybe there are a few Native staff that they can connect to, but it can feel really isolating, okay? And so with that, I just wanna make sure that it's important to emphasize the hard work and effort made by Native students as much as, you know, their unique cultural practices, right? Let's make sure that we balance that out.
So Stephanie did mention Native faculty and staff. What are your campuses doing to provide opportunities for Native faculty to advance or either be mentored or mentor other Native faculty? Do you even have Native faculty on your campus? That's important. Do you have Native staff on your campus? We need to see each other and we need to connect with each other. If you don't have Native faculty and staff on your campus, that is what you need to do, is hire them. So when we get these people into those positions though, how are you supporting them? What types of community support networks exist for Native faculty and staff? Because they need the institutional support just as much as students do.
So in this next bullet here, this is mostly me coming from a psychology background. But one thing that I think it's important to consider is, how has your understanding of Indigenous peoples been created? Okay, so as a social psychologist, one of the things that I teach about is automatic versus controlled thinking, okay? Now, as Emma and I have already kind of talked about earlier, much of the ways in which the violence towards Native American and Indigenous women is perpetuated is through seemingly innocuous instances, right? Like, oh, some representations, some depictions, maybe again, people think, well, cultural appropriation is not that big of a deal. And even when we're talking about federal government policies, which were from seemingly good intentions, although that we know that's not true. So when you think about it, why is it such a big deal when we talk about brands containing Native imagery like Land O'Lakes, right? Or why some teams have some Native American imagery in their sports mascots and branding? Well, besides the many reasons that have already been specified through stories, quantitative data, qualitative data, and all that realm of research, it's because of how we navigate the world, okay? Our brains love being on autopilot, and that's because it makes it so much easier for us to go about our daily lives. And this means that we rely so much more on automatic thinking than deliberative, conscious, controlled thinking. So when we are surrounded by these brand images, when we hear people say or say ourselves, oh, they're on the warpath, or hey, let's have a powwow, when we are taught only the basic information about Native and Indigenous peoples in school, right, that there were Indian wars, or that they were nomadic hunter and gatherers, right? When we see information being spread about our missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that information is framed through victim blaming or is completely ignored and not talked about at all of these things shape the way that you think about Native people. It affects everyone, okay? It affects us. It affects how we think of ourselves and other Native people. And so I challenge you to be more intentional about your attitudes towards Indigenous peoples, and to interrogate where the information comes from, all right? Not only that, but how is it presented in certain contexts over others? Because this affects how you respond to anti-Native American incidences on campus, or how you treat your Native American students, how you treat your Native American faculty, how you treat your Native American staff members, or whether or not you make it a point to acknowledge that you are on stolen Indigenous land and that you have an obligation to Indigenous peoples.
I think to go off what you're saying more is, what are you doing to be proactive and not reactive when incidents of racism and dehumanization eventually happen on campus? Because it's not if, it's when. They do happen daily. So I also want to talk about how stories are data. There's a tendency in the Western world, especially the scientific world, to value numbers over stories. This creates a system that not only privileges certain types of knowledge, experience, wisdom, and information gathering over the other, but it systematically devalues, belittles, and ultimately dismisses any knowledge that does not come from or actively benefit the dominant group. So this does a great disservice not only to how we conduct and understand research, but how primarily Indigenous and other marginalized students come to knowledge. Within myself and the Native community, we know that stories are how we see the world, how we come to know, and it's typically not valued within the Western institution. We need to remember that this is how we learn, and this is how we tell things, and this is how we communicate. So
finally, I want to talk a bit about raising awareness about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So we provided some very brief statistics. We didn't really go in depth about the actual issue. And so it's important to educate yourself, right? The Urban Indian Health Institute has the 2018 report, and they have lots of other reports and great information. Even if you go on Google and type in MMIWG, it'll take you to tons and tons of resources for helping out, donating, even finding groups that may exist around your area, right? I've also found that connecting on Facebook is a really great idea. There are groups that will, that once you're a part of them, you can help spread information for women who go missing, or even be on the lookout for yourself for them. Search groups are often created and conducted through these Facebook groups. So people who are able to help try to find, where these women may have gone to, or if they are lost. Facebook is a really great way to be able to connect to people. Also, any protest, rallies, speakers, anytime you can find that on campus. I know there's been a few already here at OU. Also to increase your, this helps to increase information networks, right? But again, it really helps to be educated on the issue, because even if you're Native and Indigenous, you may have an understanding of what's going on, but you may not know how to help. And if you are not Native, it's still very helpful for you to be an ally in this, in doing this work. You can also, again, like I said, donate to MMIWG organizations and look for local chapters. I know that Oklahoma has, I think, 2 or 3 local chapters in the state, and our Native sorority GDP is doing really great things as far as raising awareness, hosting fundraisers for not only missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, but also Native women who are victims of domestic violence. And so with that, we would like to say thank you. Thank you to NCORE for inviting us to do this webinar, especially to Asia for helping us fine tune everything, because it definitely needed we needed some help. And our information is here if you want to contact us about anything further. So thank you.
thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you so much, Emma, for this amazing presentation. We had a couple of folks in the chat box that said that they needed to leave early, which is fine. We totally understand that. We got a couple of questions, and I'm going to encourage everybody again, as I did earlier, that if you have a question, please use the Q&A box. We're going to make it our goal to answer all the questions. We have about a little over 15 minutes to answer questions. So the first question is from Sarah Clark, and she asks, is there a difference between settler colonialism and colonialism?
Yes. So colonialism is like when we think of, one of the best examples would probably be India. So whenever white, well, they're not always white, but whenever colonizers come into a territory, they use the resources and then they leave. So that's colonization. Settler colonization is whenever the settlers come into a territory, they use the resources, they use the land, they make a home to stay, and then they repeat colonizing practices. So America is probably the best example of settler colonialism.
Okay. So Kate asked a few questions. I'm gonna try to get through them all, Kate. So the first one is, what resources would you recommend to learn more about land-grant universities and settler colonialism?
Land grant?
So unfortunately, this is not my territory. I'm more of a quant person, so I hate to leave it to Emma to do it, but.
Yeah, I would look at, the resources that I use. I use Patrick Wolf. I used Eve Tuck, Law Paperson, which is a book is called A Third University is Possible. So I really think that talks about the university as a settler colonialism site. Like, I really appreciate that book, and it's very short it's little tiny. You can read it in literally a day, and it will give you some information about that. I suggest just really, I'm still looking at it, so I don't know too much where to email me, please. I will send you the resources I have. That's a good idea. Thank you, Stephanie. Then I can give you what you are asking for, because I have the books. I just don't know all the names of them. Thank you.
Stephanie, your mom said hi. So the second question is, given the relatively small number of Indigenous students in higher ed, it seems that interracial solidarity is key to improving their experiences. Do you agree? And if so, do you see examples of where this kind of solidarity is happening and working, whatever working means?
I mean, yeah, I think that whenever you have instances on campus where there are racial incidences, you see multiple groups coming together to support, be allies. I think that as our group, as the, we are part of the Indigenous Graduate Student Alliance here at OU, and we would have a graduate diversity roundtable with all the other minority graduate student groups. So we would work together on issues and come together. And I feel like that helps to know what other groups are out there. And also so you can connect together and do fun things, not just things that focus on what is going on, what's bad. So sometimes we'd have movie nights or just get together and talk and just hang out. So I think that's important as well. Do you have anything to add?
One thing that's coming to mind actually is an event that just finished up was the sit-in with the Black Emergency Response Team, and they made a point of acknowledging Indigenous students on campus fighting for a unique space and acknowledging of the work that the Native students did here, and I think that's really important. And so it wasn't even a question for us to be able to show up to the sit-in as well. Like, it's important for us to show that we support other marginalized groups, and especially Black students on campus who are, unfortunately, they are hyper visible. And so anytime that we can show up and help and understand, like, and combat anti-Blackness in our communities, we think that's important. So that's just speaking from OU. I'm sure a lot of that solidarity is happening in other institutions, but that's coming to mind now because it just happened.
Yeah, we've had a couple of incidents I'm sure that folks have seen across the country. We've made some national news in the last couple of weeks. So the last question was, what things do you each do to take care of yourselves mentally and emotionally while doing personal research?
Oh, wow.
That's actually thank you for that question, because I didn't realize how much of a toll this research was taking on me. I would sit in my office and I would read articles about, proclivity to rape, sexual objectification, how Indigenous women are framed in media, newspapers, and I would get so tired and I couldn't understand why. And I didn't want to go to my office. And as I was talking to my mentor, she was like, "This is taking a toll on you. Like, this is traumatic, like this is harmful." And it didn't occur to me to make that connection. And I think being in psychology, I think we're taught a lot to be, oh, you need to be objective and, you know, don't insert yourself, and that's just impossible. And so understanding that I'm connected to this research and this information at more of a personal level helped me to kind of navigate carefully the articles that I was reading. And so I make it a point to, I'm grateful that I have a support network here on campus that I can talk with and to about all of these issues. I have a very supportive partner, and she's, even if she doesn't totally understand, like, you know, the intricacies of Native issues, she's very willing to listen to me and offer advice and just be there to listen, right? So for me, I'm an alone, like, introvert, so I just need to be alone a lot. So I'm grateful to have friends that don't make me be alone all the time.
I basically, you know, the research that we're doing is hard. The things that we have to research to look up for our lit reviews or what we're studying, or even sometimes for our professors, it's not always nice and pretty. And same as Stephanie, I felt myself getting really drained and like crying whenever I'm reading some of these articles, because it is traumatizing to read about what happened to our ancestors. It doesn't feel like it was long ago. So I try to just work out. I try to talk to my friends. I hang out with, you know, my peers on campus. I try to take time to do things that are not research-based, or if I'm reading something, I will make it completely opposite of anything academic. So I just try to do things like that to get my mind out of that realm that can consume us, especially in this type of climate that we live in today.
Thank you so much for that response. I'll also add that, you know, I think there's value in looking at research from a pro-social perspective. So I know we do a lot of critical research. I know I do a lot of critical research. So sometimes thinking about how critical research has a pro-social benefit as well, like how do you think about it in a different way to sort of empower those the subjects of the research. So yeah, I'll just add that. So Christopher Ross asks, do you think it's appropriate for non-Native people to call out microaggressions when witnessed?
Of course, please do that. Yes, if you witness anything that's microaggressive, call it out. We need people that are non-Native, are you know, not people of color. I mean, we need anyone we can to help call these things out, because sometimes those person within that experience doesn't always speak up. I know that I haven't. Would I like someone stepping in my benefit if I didn't speak? Of course I would have, because it's hard enough being there doing it by myself. If someone else is speaking up for me, like it would have made a world of difference.
Yeah, I agree.
So Sarah, yes, there will be a recording available. It'll be available within the next week. We'll post, we post all of our free webinar recordings on our YouTube page and on our website. So that was one question. Someone else asked, would it be possible to view slide 34 on human nature? If you want to move the slide to slide 34.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I can't see the number. Is it?
Oh, this is 32, so go to, yeah, there we go. So we'll keep that up for a little bit unless someone asks to change. So someone asked, how does the objectification of Native women and MMING affect women's rights to tribal resources? For example, blood quotient issues.
Blood quantum issues?
Excuse me. Yes.
Can you say that again?
So how does the objectification of Native women and missing and murdered Indigenous Native women affect women's rights to tribal resources?
So first of all, I kind of mentioned earlier about how Indigenous people in the United States, if you are not if you're not enrolled in a federally recognized tribe, then you do not have access to some of those resources that tribal citizens do. And so that's one way. And I think that that is speaking to a type of objectification of like indigeneity and Native people in general, right? Because when we think of blood quantum, that is a terrible, terrible system that was imposed on us, right?
Meant to be genocidal.
And it's meant, right? And that's another component or another way that settler colonialism is allowed to continue, or that it needs that to continue, right? And so when I'm thinking about that question specifically, it makes me think of, first of all, like I said, some Indigenous people who may have grown up around, you know, that tribe or have tribal family members, they're cut off to certain resources because they don't have the card, right? They don't have the citizenship card. But also I know that there are issues of identifying like Indigenous women, because a lot of our women who are found and they are murdered, they are misidentified, and they're not identified as being Native. They're actually identified more as being like Latina or Black. And that is an issue in and of itself. And so to think about objectification and of Indigenous women and their access to tribal resources, I feel like beyond what I've been able to say, I would definitely need a little bit more time to think about it. But I think that those are some things that could help like kind of understand that more. I don't know if that helped at all, but those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about when hearing that question.
If you want to go back to the last slide again so that folks can have your email address. So Naomi Johnson says, I've experienced those kinds of trauma too. Explained to my mentor who is non-Native and was told to grow into an objective scientist. So she agrees with you and can't and doesn't think that she should try to disconnect from the work.
No,
I agree.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like I said, we as Native people, we do this research with the objective of giving back to our communities. We usually do work with our communities, not with our communities. So how can we be objective? How can we be unbiased in that? It's us, it's our lives. Like, obviously, we're both doing our research because we've experienced something. So I can't remove myself from that, and I frankly refuse to. And I suggest other people do that too. Like, there is research backing up reasons why we can't, and no one's objective, really.
That was the other thing, is that we have to push back on this idea that just because we're not white and that we belong to other marginalized groups, that we're somehow less objective, or maybe not even that somehow being white makes you more objective, right? And that's just not the case. So
I think that's really powerful. The article that I emailed you all, did you all get a chance to look at it?
yes.
Yeah. So the other question is, are there any statistics on the police response time when responding to missing and murdered Indigenous women?
You know, I saw that question and I've been thinking about it, and I'm not sure, but I would look at some of those reports and like the online resources connected to MMIWG, because there might be variables that they've taken, maybe that, I don't know, like maybe it's there, but we haven't looked at it yet, but I'm not entirely sure. I work less with like big data. And so I don't know that I don't know that I've seen like a report about that specifically. So that would be something worth investigating though.
So the last question we have, with 3 minutes to spare, could you speak to the experience of gender non-binary Indigenous people from the perspective of your work?
So the one thing about MMIWG is that there's the recognition that it's not only women and girls, right? It's other Indigenous people, but it is especially harmful for our LGBTQ and Two-Spirit Indigenous populations. And so for me, because of the ways in which our psychology department gathers our subject pool for participants who participate in our research, unfortunately, we do not have a lot of Native people in general. And so a lot of my research has had to focus on attitudes about Native peoples instead of like objectification of the Native self, if that makes sense, which is something I'm very interested in, but I don't have enough participants to be able to do that. So for me, I haven't been able to do that kind of work. I think it's really important, especially because like I said, I am a queer Indigenous person, but to get through my PhD, I have to focus on more quantitative statistical analyses and methodologies. I don't know if it's something that you're interested in or looking at.
Can you repeat the question again?
Like including like non-binary and
It doesn't matter to me because it's just Native American doctoral students' experiences. So the only reason that I drew out women in this is because of this presentation. Like, so there's not a lot of us. Obviously, I haven't interviewed a lot of people yet, and I would include whatever gender that people prefer.
different gender identities,
Different identities, expressions, sexualities. Yes, thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah.
So it's just, I'm just focusing on experiences.
Well, we've reached our time to close. And so again, the Southwest Center is so grateful for your expertise. I appreciate you all being willing to do this for us. This is the last student webinar of the season. We are currently reviewing abstracts and proposals for next season and putting them together. Again, thank you for closing our student webinar sessions out. I ask that you all join us next month for Dr. Henriquez Aldana's presentation. It'll be the last Wednesday of the month. All right, have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.